You've entered void of rules, a realm where normal constraints cease to exist. But beware, traveller, there is one rule here. You've got to hit subscribe. Seriously, it's the only rule we have. We just reached 1,000 brave souls, and we're hunting for 9,000 more to complete our dark ritual. I mean, reach our next goal, so subscribe. Or don't. But remember, the void remembers those who defy the only rule. Now let's get into today's video. My name is Austin Keller, and I'm about to tell you the most important story you'll ever hear. If you're listening to this recording, it means someone found my camera equipment scattered across a forest road in northern Wyoming. It means they discovered the 47 minutes of footage I shot in a place that shouldn't exist, speaking to people who died 80 years ago. I need you to understand something before I begin. I wasn't some amateur ghost hunter looking for thrills. I wasn't a desperate content creator chasing views. I was a professional documentary filmmaker with 12 years of experience exploring forgotten corners of America. I'd investigate everything from abandoned mining towns to defunct military installations, always approaching my work with methodical precision and healthy skepticism. But Raven's Hollow changed everything I believed about the world. 3 weeks ago, I was editing footage from my latest project, a series about company towns that vanished during the Great Depression, when an encrypted message arrived through my website's contact form. The sender identified himself only as Harper, and his message was unlike anything I'd received in my career. "Austin," it began, "I know your work. I've watched every episode of Hidden America. You find places that don't want to be found, but I have something different for you. Something that will change how you see reality itself. There's a town in northern Wyoming that was completely erased from existence in 1943. Not abandoned, erased. No maps, no satellite images, no government records. Most people who know about it won't talk, and those who do are usually dismissed as crazy. But it's real, Austin. Raven's Hollow is real, and it's waiting for someone like you to tell its story." The message included GPS coordinates and a warning that normal navigation wouldn't work once I got close. Harper provided hand-drawn maps and detailed directions that read like something from a treasure hunt. He also included a single photograph, a sepia-toned image of a main street that looked like it belonged in a 1940s postcard, complete with vintage cars and people in period clothing walking along pristine sidewalks. Most filmmakers would have deleted the message as an elaborate hoax, but something about Harper's tone felt different. There was an urgency in his words, a weight that suggested he was sharing something precious and dangerous. The photograph looked authentic in ways that digital manipulation couldn't replicate. The lighting was perfect, the shadows fell naturally, and the people in the image had that indefinable quality of genuine, candid moments. I spent 2 days researching the coordinates Harper had provided. They pointed to a remote section of the Bighorn National Forest, an area so isolated that even experienced hikers rarely ventured there. Official Forest Service maps showed nothing but wilderness. No roads, no structures, no indication that humans had ever set foot in that particular valley. But when I cross-referenced the coordinates with historical geological surveys from the 1940s, I found something interesting. There was a notation about industrial activity discontinued in 1943 in that exact location. The note was brief and clinical, but it suggested that something significant had once existed, where my maps now showed only empty forest. That was enough to convince me to make the trip. I packed my professional equipment, 2 cameras, backup batteries, audio recording gear, and enough supplies for 3 days in case I got lost. I also brought my grandfather's compass, a relic from his Navy service that had never failed me during remote shoots. Something told me I'd need reliable navigation where I was going. The drive from Denver took 6 hours, following Interstate 25 north through Colorado and into Wyoming. The autumn landscape was stunning. Golden aspen groves nestled between dark pine forests, with snow-capped peaks rising in the distance. But as I left the interstate and followed Harper's directions onto increasingly remote state highways, the beauty took on an ominous quality. The roads grew narrower and more deserted with each turn. I passed abandoned gas stations and boarded up motels that looked like they'd been closed for decades. The few other vehicles I encountered were locals in pickup trucks who watched my rental car with suspicious eyes, as if they knew exactly where I was heading and disapproved of my destination. After 2 hours on back roads, my GPS signal flickered and died. The last thing it showed was my location as a blank space between mapped areas, a void where cartographers had simply given up trying to chart the terrain. From that point forward, I relied entirely on Harper's handwritten directions. "Turn left at the lightning-struck oak." His notes instructed, "The tree will be split perfectly down the middle, burned black but still alive. You'll know it when you see it." I found the oak exactly as described. A massive tree that had been cleaved in half by lightning, its charred trunk marking the entrance to a dirt road that didn't appear on any of my maps. The road was barely wide enough for my car, winding through dense forest that seemed to close in around me with each mile. "Follow the dirt road for 37 minutes exactly," Harper's next instruction read. "Do not stop. Do not turn around. Do not deviate from the path. You will want to give up. The road will seem to lead nowhere, but trust the directions. At exactly 37 minutes, you will see 2 boulders shaped like sleeping giants. Take the path between them." The drive felt endless. The dirt road curved and twisted through forest, so thick that sunlight barely penetrated the canopy. My odometer showed I was traveling at barely 15 miles per hour, navigating ruts and fallen branches that threatened to damage my rental car. Several times I considered turning back, convinced that Harper had sent me on a wild goose chase through the Wyoming wilderness. But at exactly 37 minutes, just as I was about to give up, the trees parted to reveal 2 enormous boulders sitting beside the road. From the right angle, they did indeed look like sleeping giants, massive stone figures reclining against the mountainside. Between them ran a narrow path that looked more like a game trail than anything meant for vehicles. "Drive until the trees part like a curtain," Harper's final instruction promised. "When you see Raven's Hollow, you'll understand why it was hidden from the world." I followed the path for another 20 minutes, my car bouncing over rocks and roots as I descended into what felt like the heart of the mountain. The forest grew older and wilder around me, trees so massive they could have been standing when Lewis and Clark crossed the continent. The silence was absolute except for my engines labouring and the crunch of branches beneath my tyres. Then, without warning, the trees ended. I emerged into a hidden valley that took my breath away. Spread below me was a complete town from the 1940s, preserved so perfectly it looked like a movie set. Every building stood intact and undamaged. Art Deco storefronts lined Main Street with their neon signs dark but unbroken. Chrome-bumpered automobiles sat parked along tree-lined streets as if their owners had just stepped away for a moment. The valley itself was impossible. A perfect circle of flat land surrounded by mountains that should have made such a formation geologically unlikely. Raven's Hollow sat in the center like a jewel in a setting, protected from the outside world by walls of stone and forest. I parked at the valley's edge and checked my equipment. My cameras were functioning normally, but my cell phone showed no signal, and my GPS remained blank. According to my watch, it was 9:15 a.m. Plenty of time to explore before sunset if Harper's warnings about leaving before dark proved to be more than superstition. The sign at the town's entrance was weathered, but clearly readable. Raven's Hollow founded, 1921, population 734. below the town's name was a smaller sign that made my blood run cold. Last updated September 16th, 1943. I shouldered my camera gear and walked into Raven's Hollow, feeling like an explorer entering a lost civilization. The silence was the first thing that struck me, not just an absence of people, but a complete lack of ambient sound. No wind rustling through trees, no birds singing, no insects buzzing. Even my footsteps seemed muffled, as if the town itself was absorbing sound. The preservation was impossible to believe. Paint that should have peeled decades ago still gleamed on storefront signs. Chrome that should have rusted still reflected the morning sun. Windows that should have been broken by weather or vandals remained perfectly intact. It was as if time had simply stopped in Raven's Hollow on that September day in 1943. I began filming immediately, documenting everything with the systematic approach that had made my career. But even through my camera's viewfinder, the town felt wrong in ways I couldn't articulate. The shadows fell at slightly incorrect angles. The light had a quality I'd never seen before. Not quite natural sunlight, but not artificial either. And there was a sense of being watched, even though the streets were completely empty. The first building I entered was the visitor centre, a cheerful structure with "Welcome to Raven's Hollow" painted in yellow letters across its facade. Like every other door I would encounter in that cursed town, it was unlocked. The interior was thick with dust except for one item, a leather-bound ledger sitting open on the reception desk, as if someone had just finished writing in it. The page displayed essential protocols for visitors to Raven's Hollow in elegant fountain pen script. Below the title were 13 rules, numbered and clearly defined. Rule 1. Visit only between dawn and dusk, 6 AM to 6 PM sharp. Rule 2. Never enter buildings displaying purple ribbons on their doors. Rule 3. When the town siren sounds, immediately stop moving and face north until silence returns. Rule 4. Do not disturb any personal items. Observe but never touch. Rule 5. Avoid the cemetery after 3 PM under any circumstances. Rule 6. If approached by the newspaper boy, accept his paper but speak no words to him. Rule 7. Walk only on sidewalks and paved streets. Never cross onto lawns or gardens. Rule 8. Should any building's lights illuminate while you're inside, exit through your entry point immediately. Rule 9. Do not look directly into mirrors found within any residence. Rule 10. The hotel lobby welcomes visitors for viewing only. Do not attempt to register. Rule 11. If you observe smoke rising from the factory smokestacks, evacuate to the town's eastern border immediately. Rule 12. Never remain in Raven's Hollow after the streetlights activate. Rule 13. Trust only these written rules. Ignore all other instructions you may encounter. At the bottom of the page was a handwritten note in different ink. These rules exist for your protection and ours. Previous visitors who followed them exactly returned safely to their world. Those who didn't remain with us forever, please respect our home as we respect your life. I flipped through the ledger's pages and found hundreds of signatures dating back to 1955. Each entry included a date, name, and brief comment. Some were matter-of-fact, followed all rules, fascinating place. Others were more disturbing. The children in the school playground waved at me through the fence, but they had no faces. Heard my dead father calling my name from inside a purple ribbon house. The most recent entry was from 2 weeks earlier, signed by someone named Skylar Morrison. Rules are not suggestions. They are the only thing standing between you and joining the 734. Do not trust the factory rules. Do not deviate. Do not assume you understand what you're seeing. The handwriting was shaky, desperate, as if Skylar had been writing under extreme stress. I initially dismissed the rules as an elaborate piece of performance art, or a tourist gimmick designed to enhance the town's mysterious atmosphere. But the authenticity of the aged paper and the genuine fear in some of the ledger entries made me reconsider. I decided to treat the protocols as part of the town's mystery while documenting everything for my film. Besides, some of the rules made practical sense. Don't disturb personal belongings. That was basic respect for historical preservation. Don't enter buildings after dark. That was simple safety in an unfamiliar place. Don't trust alternate instructions. That seemed like good advice in any situation where someone might try to mislead visitors. I began my systematic exploration of Ravens Hollow, starting with Main Street. The business district was a perfectly preserved slice of 1940s America. Watson's Five and Dime still had penny candy in glass jars behind its counter. Schultz Family Bakery displayed loaves of bread in its window cases, though they were now mummified by decades of dry air. The Regal Theatre advertised Casablanca now showing on its marquee, the letters still bright after 80 years. I spent an hour documenting the storefronts before venturing into the residential areas. The houses were where Ravens Hollow's true strangeness became apparent. These weren't just empty buildings. They were complete domestic scenes frozen in time, as if their inhabitants had simply vanished in the middle of their daily routines. In a blue Victorian on Elm Street, I found a family dinner still set on the dining room table. 4 plates contained the desiccated remains of what had once been pot roast and vegetables. A child's glass of milk had evaporated, leaving only a ring of calcium residue. The newspaper beside the father's plate was dated September 16th, 1943, with headlines about Allied victories in Italy. The master bedroom contained a woman's dress laid out on the bed, as if she'd been preparing for an evening out. A man's work clothes were draped over a chair, still holding the shape of his body. On the nightstand sat a love letter, handwritten in purple ink. My darling Margaret, I know the factory work keeps me away too many evenings, but the war effort needs every man. When this is over, we'll take that trip to California you've always wanted. All my love, William. Following Rule 4 religiously, I touched nothing, only filmed. But the temptation was overwhelming. I wanted to open dresser drawers, read personal letters, examine family photographs more closely. The restraint required was maddening, especially when every room contained tantalizing glimpses into lives cut short by tragedy. In the children's bedrooms, I found toys scattered on floors, exactly where they'd been dropped 8 decades ago. A train set was frozen mid-crash on a bedroom floor, its tiny locomotive derailed, but unbroken. Dolls sat in miniature tea party arrangements, their painted faces still smiling at guests who would never arrive. One child's diary lay open on a desk to an entry dated September 15th, 1943. Daddy says the factory's making special bombs to help win the war. They make loud noises all day and night now. Mommy says I shouldn't worry, but I heard her crying when she thought I was asleep. Each house told a similar story. Lives interrupted so suddenly that nothing had been put away, cleaned up, or prepared for departure. It was as if every resident of Ravens Hollow had simply vanished at the same instant, leaving behind a perfect snapshot of a community frozen at the moment of its destruction. At 1:47 p.m, while I was filming the town's barbershop, a piercing siren began to wail across Ravens Hollow. The sound was unlike anything I'd ever heard. Not quite an air raid siren, not quite a factory whistle, but something that seemed to come from the town itself. It raised every hair on my body and filled me with a primal terror that I couldn't explain. Remembering Rule 3, I immediately stopped moving and turned to face north. Through the barbershop's window, I could see the entire length of Main Street, and what I witnessed there will haunt me. for whatever remains of my life. Figures began emerging from every building in town. They looked like people from a distance, but as my eyes focused, I realized I could see right through them to the structures behind. Men in work clothes, women in house dresses, children in school uniforms, all walking with purpose towards the town centre, all transparent as morning mist. They moved with the unhurried pace of people, following a familiar routine. Some carried briefcases or lunch pails, others held children's hands or pushed baby carriages. A few waved to neighbours across the street with the casual friendliness of a small community where everyone knew everyone else. But their faces were wrong. Where features should have been, there were only suggestions of eyes, noses and mouths, as if someone had tried to sculpt human faces from fog and failed to capture the details. They looked like photographs that had been overexposed, with all the contrast washed out until only ghostly impressions remained. The siren continued for exactly 90 seconds before cutting off abruptly. When silence returned, the figures began to fade, becoming more transparent with each passing moment until they vanished completely. Within minutes, the streets were empty again, showing no trace of the supernatural parade I'd just witnessed. My hands were shaking as I adjusted my camera settings, trying to process what I'd experienced. I rewound the footage and watched it again, confirming that my equipment had captured everything. The figures showed up clearly on video, which meant this wasn't a hallucination or trick of light. I had documented genuine paranormal activity, the kind of evidence that could revolutionize our understanding of life after death. But even as excitement coursed through me, a deeper fear was taking root. These weren't just random spirits haunting an abandoned town. They were the entire population of Raven's Hollow, still going about their daily routines 80 years after their deaths. And the rules in the visitor centre suggested that living people could somehow join their eternal community under the right circumstances. I continued my exploration with new respect for the protocols I'd initially dismissed. Whatever force kept Raven's Hollow suspended between life and death was clearly powerful enough to maintain the town's physical preservation and animate the spirits of its former residents. The rules weren't suggestions or artistic flourishes, they were survival instructions. An hour later, while filming the town square, I encountered the newspaper boy. He appeared from behind the gazebo as if he'd been waiting for me, though I was certain the area had been empty moments before. He looked completely solid and real, unlike the transparent figures from the siren event. A boy of perhaps 12 wearing knickers, suspenders and a cloth cap, carrying a canvas bag filled with newspapers. He approached with the confident stride of someone performing a familiar task, whistling a tune I recognized as "Don't Sit Under the Apple Tree." When he reached me, he smiled politely and offered a newspaper from his bag, exactly as Rule 6 had predicted. Following the protocol, I remained silent and accepted the paper. It felt real in my hands, genuine newsprint with the slight roughness of 1940s paper stock. The masthead read The Raven's Hollow Gazette and was dated September 18th, 1943. The headline made my blood freeze. Mysterious visitors continue to respect town traditions. Local spirits express gratitude. The article was written in the cheerful style of small-town journalism, but its content was unlike anything that should have existed in a 1943 newspaper. For the 12th consecutive year, living visitors to our community have demonstrated remarkable respect for local customs and protocols. The Raven's Hollow Chamber of Commerce wishes to thank these breathing guests for following established guidelines that allow our residents to maintain their peaceful coexistence with the world of the living. As reported in previous editions, visitors who follow the 13 essential protocols are welcomed and protected during their stay. Those who respect our traditions return safely to their world with fascinating stories and often groundbreaking documentary evidence of life beyond death. However, the chamber must also note with sadness that 3 visitors in the past decade chose to ignore our guidelines. These individuals, while initially resistant to joining our community permanently, have since adapted well to their new circumstances. They can often be seen contributing to daily life in Ravens Hollow, though they retain some memories of their previous existence. We encourage all future visitors to read the essential protocols carefully and follow them precisely. Our town exists in a delicate balance between worlds, and this balance must be maintained for everyone's safety and happiness. The newspaper boy tipped his cap politely and continued his route, walking from building to building with the same purposeful stride he'd probably maintained since 1943. I watched him distribute papers to empty buildings, his whistling growing fainter as he moved away from the town centre. I folded the newspaper carefully and slipped it into my jacket pocket, one of the few items I was allowed to take from Ravens Hollow according to the rules. The article's implications were staggering. Not only were the town's residents aware of modern visitors, but they had been documenting these encounters for decades in their ghostly newspaper. The mention of 3 visitors who had joined the community permanently was particularly chilling. According to the article, people who broke the rules didn't simply die or disappear. They became part of Ravens Hollow's eternal population, trapped in the same supernatural loop as the original residents. I made my way to the town library, hoping to find more information about Ravens Hollow's history. The building was magnificent. A Carnegie library with stained glass windows depicting scenes from American literature and towering shelves filled with books that looked freshly dusted, despite 8 decades of abandonment. The library's catalogue system was still functional, with handwritten cards filed alphabetically in wooden drawers. I found an extensive local history section and began researching the town's origins and ultimate fate. What I discovered painted a picture of a community that had been doomed from its very beginning. Ravens Hollow was founded in 1921 as a company town built around the Patriot Munitions manufacturing company. The factory was established to produce artillery shells for the US military, taking advantage of Wyoming's remote location and abundant mineral resources. The town grew rapidly during the 1920s and 1930s as workers and their families moved to the valley, seeking steady employment during the Great Depression. By 1943, Ravens Hollow had a population of exactly 734 people, all of whom were directly or indirectly employed by the munitions factory. The community was remarkably close-knit, with a school, church, library, hospital, and all the amenities of a thriving small town. Residents took pride in their contribution to the war effort, working extra shifts to meet the military's increasing demand for advanced weaponry. But success bred ambition, and ambition led to tragedy. According to classified documents that had somehow found their way into the library's collection, Patriot Munitions had been experimenting with new types of explosive compounds in the months leading up to September 1943. These chemicals were designed to create more powerful artillery shells that could penetrate German fortifications, giving Allied forces a decisive advantage in the war's final stages. The experimental compounds were unstable in ways that the factory's chemists didn't fully understand. They produced shells with unprecedented destructive power, but the manufacturing process required precise temperature and humidity controls that were difficult to maintain in Ravens Hollow's mountain environment. On the morning of September 16th, 1943, the equipment malfunction caused temperatures in the main production facility to spike above safe levels. The experimental chemicals became unstable and began a chain reaction that couldn't be stopped. Workers tried to evacuate the factory, but the reaction was too fast and too powerful. At 11:23 a.m., the Patriot Munitions factory exploded with the force of a small nuclear weapon. The blast was so powerful it could be felt in Denver, 300 miles away. Seismographs registered it as a magnitude 4.2 earthquake. The chemical fire that followed burned for 6 days, consuming everything in the valley and creating toxic clouds that made the area uninhabitable. All 734 residents of Ravens Hollow died instantly, their bodies vaporized by the explosion and chemical fire. The military immediately classified the incident as a national security matter and cordoned off the entire valley. Within weeks, Ravens Hollow was erased from all official maps and records. The town simply ceased to exist in the world's memory. But the library's archives suggested that death had not been the end for Ravens Hollow's residents. Reports began surfacing within months of the disaster. Families from neighbouring towns claimed to see their deceased relatives walking the streets of the valley, continuing their daily routines as if nothing had changed. Hunters reported encountering a perfectly preserved town where they expected to find only charred ruins. Military personnel assigned to guard the area described seeing lights in windows and smoke from chimneys, though official reports insisted the valley was completely uninhabitable. The military dismissed these accounts as grief-induced hallucinations or radiation-related psychological effects from the chemical explosion, but the sightings continued for decades, eventually attracting the attention of researchers interested in paranormal phenomena. According to a 1955 report by Dr. Elizabeth Hartwell, a parapsychologist from the University of Chicago, Ravens Hollow existed in what she termed a state of temporal displacement. The explosion had been so traumatic and sudden that the town's residents had refused to accept their deaths, collectively willing themselves to continue existing in a version of their community frozen at the moment before the disaster. Dr. Hartwell theorized that Ravens Hollow operated according to supernatural laws that allowed the living and the dead to coexist under specific circumstances. The 13 rules weren't arbitrary restrictions. They were guidelines for safely navigating the boundary between life and death, ensuring that visitors could observe the town without becoming trapped in its eternal loop. Her research had been abruptly discontinued when she failed to return from her final expedition to Ravens Hollow in December 1955. The university officially declared her missing and presumed dead, though locals claimed to have seen a woman matching her description walking the town's streets in 1960s clothing during subsequent sightings. As I read these accounts, I began to understand the true nature of Ravens Hollow. This wasn't just a haunted town, it was a complete alternate reality where the dead had created their own version of life, sustained by collective will and protected by supernatural forces that I couldn't begin to comprehend. The rules weren't just about safety, they were about respect. The residents of Ravens Hollow had found a way to continue existing after death, and they were willing to share their miraculous town with the living as long as visitors followed protocols that maintained the delicate balance between worlds. But as I would soon discover, that balance could be disrupted by the smallest mistake. I noticed several buildings throughout the town marked with deep purple silk ribbons tied to their doorknobs, exactly as mentioned in Rule 2. These structures seemed to draw my attention like magnets, standing out among the other buildings with an almost hypnotic allure. The purple ribbon buildings were different from the rest of Ravens Hollow, in subtle but important ways. Their paint was slightly more faded, their windows were darker, and they seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Through their windows, I could see movement inside. Shadows pacing back and forth, curtains shifting without wind, and occasional glimpses of pale faces watching me from behind glass. One building in particular fascinated me, a 2-story house on Maple Street with elaborate Victorian gingerbread trim and a wraparound porch. The purple ribbon on its front door seemed to flutter in an unfelt breeze, and I could swear I heard faint voices calling my name from within. The voices were almost familiar, like people I'd known long ago but couldn't quite place. They spoke in warm, welcoming tones, inviting me to come inside and see the wonders they wanted to share. The temptation was overwhelming. Every instinct I'd developed as a documentary filmmaker urged me to investigate, to push past barriers and uncover hidden truths. But the desperate tone of Skylar Morrison's ledger entry kept me focused on following the rules exactly as written. Whatever was inside the purple ribbon buildings was powerful enough to lure visitors from the safety of the protocols, and I wasn't about to become the fourth person to join the community permanently. At 3:30 p.m, I decided to investigate the munitions factory where the original disaster had occurred. The building dominated the eastern edge of town, a sprawling complex of red brick structures and towering smokestacks that rose like monuments to industrial ambition. Even in abandonment, the factory retained an aura of dangerous power, as if the forces that had destroyed Raven's Hollow still lingered within its walls. The main gate stood open, its chain-link fence twisted by the explosion but still standing after 8 decades. I walked through the factory grounds, documenting the preservation that extended even to this site of ultimate destruction. The buildings showed blast damage, broken windows, cracked walls, scorch marks on brick, but they remained structurally sound in defiance of physics and time. Inside the factory's main office building, I found something that would change everything. Posted on the wall behind the reception desk was another set of visitor rules, formatted identically to the ones I'd been following. But as I read through them, I noticed one crucial difference. Rule 11 in this version read, "If you observe smoke rising from the factory smokestacks, leave the building you're in and proceed to the town centre for further instructions." I stared at the conflicting rule, my mind racing. The version I memorised from the visitor centre said to evacuate to the town's eastern border immediately. This version told me to go to the town centre and wait for further instructions. Why were there 2 different sets of rules? Which one was correct? I began filming the alternate rules to document the discrepancy, explaining the difference to my camera. The factory rules were posted on newer paper than the visitor centre version, and the ink looked fresher. But they were signed with the same authority, Raven's Hollow Chamber of Commerce, Visitor Safety Committee. As I filmed my analysis of the competing rule sets, I noticed something else troubling. The factory rules contained subtle differences in several other protocols. Rule 9 warned against looking into mirrors after 4 p.m, rather than avoiding them entirely. Rule 12 mentioned streetlights activating at sunset rather than simply warning against remaining in town after they turned on. These variations seemed designed to create confusion, to make visitors uncertain about which protocols to follow. But why would the town's residents want to mislead their guests? The newspaper article had emphasized their gratitude for visitors who followed the rules correctly, unless the factory rules weren't created by Raven's Hollow's residents at all. As I pondered this possibility, thick black smoke began pouring from the factory's towering smokestacks. The acrid smell of burning chemicals filled the air, and I could hear machinery rumbling deep within the building's depths. It was as if my discovery of the alternate rules had triggered some kind of supernatural response, activating equipment that had been silent for 80 years. Panic gripped me as I tried to remember which version of Rule 11 I should follow. The smoke was getting thicker, and the chemical smell was making me dizzy. I needed to make a decision immediately, but the 2 rules offered completely different instructions. The visitor centre version, the original 13 protocols, written in fountain pen ink, told me to evacuate to the town's eastern border immediately. This was the version signed by hundreds of previous visitors, the rules that had guided people safely through Raven's Hollow for decades. But the factory rules seemed more official, posted in the very building where the original disaster had occurred. They bore the same authority signature and promised further instructions that might help me understand what was happening. In my confusion and fear, with toxic smoke filling my lungs and the sound of supernatural machinery growing louder, I made the worst decision of my life. I followed the factory version of Rule 11. I left the building and headed toward the town centre, reasoning that the Chamber of Commerce would provide the promised further instructions. But as I walked down Main Street, everything began to go wrong. The late afternoon sun suddenly dimmed, as if filtered through heavy clouds, though the sky remained perfectly clear. My watch showed 4:15 p.m, but streetlights throughout Ravens Hollow began flickering to life. The familiar sounds of the town, my footsteps, my breathing, the rustle of my jacket, became muffled and distorted. That's when I realized my mistake. The streetlights were activating, which meant I was violating Rule 12. But it was still afternoon. They shouldn't be turning on for another 2 hours. Unless time worked differently in Ravens Hollow when the rules were broken. Unless following the wrong version of Rule 11 had triggered supernatural consequences that accelerated the town's evening transformation. I ran toward my car, but the streets had changed. Roads that should have led directly to the valley's exit now formed an impossible maze, turning back on themselves in ways that defied the town's geography. Every path I took brought me back to the town square, where a crowd was beginning to gather. From every building emerged the 734 victims of the 1943 disaster, but now they looked completely solid and alive. They wore the clothes they'd died in, work uniforms still bearing the scorch marks and chemical stains that marked their deaths, house dresses singed by supernatural fire, children's school clothes torn by forces beyond imagination. But their faces were no longer the vague suggestions I'd seen during the siren event. They were fully formed, completely human, bearing expressions of genuine joy and welcome. They looked like neighbors greeting a new resident, like family members welcoming a long-lost relative home. They weren't threatening or malicious. If anything, they seemed genuinely happy to see me. Men removed their hats politely. Women smiled and waved. Children laughed and pointed with the innocent excitement of meeting someone new. They approached with the warm familiarity of a small community where everyone knew everyone else. But I understood with growing horror that I was about to join their eternal family, trapped forever in this place between life and death because I had trusted the wrong instructions. The factory rules hadn't been created by Ravens Hollow's residents. They were a trap designed to catch visitors who weren't careful enough to stick with the original protocols. Maybe they were the result of whatever malevolent force had caused the original disaster, still lingering in the factory and seeking new victims. Or maybe they were the creation of previous visitors who had become twisted by their supernatural transformation, wanting company in their eternal imprisonment. I don't know who created the false rules, and I suppose it doesn't matter now. What matters is that I fell for them, and that mistake is going to cost me everything. As the residents of Ravens Hollow surround me, I can feel my hiking boots being replaced by work shoes from the 1940s. My modern clothes are transforming into the style worn by the town's population. My memories of the outside world are becoming fuzzy, overlaid with new recollections of a life I never lived in a town I've never left. But part of me, the part that's speaking to you right now, still remembers who I was and what I've learned. So I'm recording this final message while I still can, hoping that someone will find my camera and learn from my fatal mistake. I followed the wrong rules. I trusted alternate instructions instead of sticking with the original 13 protocols written in the visitor center ledger. The real rules were clear. When smoke rises from the factory smokestacks, evacuate to the eastern border immediately. Don't go to the town center like I did. Don't wait for further instructions that will never come. The residents of Ravens Hollow aren't evil. They're just lonely. They've been trapped in their supernatural community for 80 years, maintaining their town through collective will and supernatural power. They welcome visitors because contact with the living helps them remember what they've lost. But they also need new residents to sustain their existence, and the false rules are their way of recruiting people who aren't careful enough to follow the real protocols. If you're listening to this, if someone finds this recording, learn from my mistake. Don't try to find Raven's Hollow. Don't follow Harper's directions, or anyone else who tries to send you to places that shouldn't exist. Don't trust alternate versions of safety rules, no matter how official they seem. And if you're foolish enough to ignore my warnings, if you're drawn to mysteries and forgotten places like I was, then at least remember this. The original 13 rules in the visitor center are your only protection. Follow them exactly. Trust nothing else, question nothing, and leave before the streetlights turn on, no matter what time your watch shows. The residents are reaching for me now, their hands warm and welcoming. A woman in a flour-dusted apron is offering to show me to my new home on Maple Street, the same Victorian house with purple ribbons that I'd been wise enough to avoid earlier. A man in factory overalls is explaining how I'll love working at the munitions plant, how the work gives life, meaning and purpose. Children are tugging at my sleeves, excited to have a new adult to play with in their eternal games. They're not lying when they say, I'll love it here. I can already feel myself becoming part of their community, accepting the rhythms of their supernatural existence. There's a peace in surrender, a comfort in knowing that I'll never have to worry about the complexities of the modern world again. Raven's Hollow exists outside of time, protected from change and loss and the countless small tragedies that make up ordinary life, but I also remember what I'm losing. My career, my family, my friends who will never know what happened to me, the stories I'll never tell, the places I'll never explore, the life I'll never finish living. That's the real tragedy of Raven's Hollow, not the supernatural imprisonment, but the willing acceptance of a half-existence in place of a full life. The woman with the flour-dusted apron is Mrs. Henderson, the town baker. She's been dead for 80 years, but she still bakes bread every morning for customers who died alongside her. The man in overalls is Tom Kowalski, a shift supervisor at the munitions factory. He still goes to work every day, operating machinery that produces shells for a war that ended before I was born. The children attend school where they learn lessons that stopped being relevant decades ago, but they're happy because happiness is easier when you don't have to grow up. This is what awaits anyone who breaks the rules of Raven's Hollow. Not death, but a kind of living death where time stops and nothing ever changes. It's seductive in its simplicity, terrifying in its permanence. I can hear my voice changing as I speak, taking on the accent and speech patterns of 1940s Wyoming. My thoughts are being overlaid with memories that aren't mine. The taste of Mrs. Henderson's fresh bread, the satisfaction of a good day's work at the factory, the sound of children playing in streets where I supposedly grew up. Soon, I won't remember being Austin Keller, the documentary filmmaker. I'll be Austin Keller, the newcomer to Raven's Hollow, grateful for the community's warm welcome. But for now, while some part of my original self remains, I want you to understand something important about what happened here. Raven's Hollow isn't just a cautionary tale about following rules, or a simple ghost story about a town that wouldn't die. It's a meditation on the nature of community, belonging, and the prices we pay for both. The residents of Raven's Hollow created something remarkable in their refusal to accept death. They built a perfect community where no one is ever lonely, where everyone has a place and a purpose, where the problems of the outside world can never intrude. It's a utopia in many ways. No crime, no poverty, no conflict, no change. Just eternal contentment in a world that never grows old. But perfection comes at a cost. The residents of Raven's Hollow traded their futures for their past, their potential for their memories. They chose certainty over possibility, comfort over growth. And now they're trying to share that choice with others. Not out of malice, but out of genuine belief that their way is better. Maybe they're right. Maybe an eternal life in a perfect community is preferable to the uncertainty and pain of the real world? I'm starting to think it might be, which is probably a sign that the transformation is nearly complete. Mrs. Henderson is explaining the layout of my new house, the Victorian with the wraparound porch that I avoided earlier. It has a beautiful garden that needs tending, she says, and a workshop in the basement where I can pursue whatever hobbies interest me. There's a library with books that update themselves to include stories from the outside world, so I'll never run out of things to read. And if I ever feel homesick for my old life, the other transplants, the visitors who chose to stay, will understand and help me through the adjustment. Tom Kowalski is describing my new job at the factory. They're always looking for people with modern technical knowledge to help improve their operations, he explains. The work is meaningful and the hours are reasonable. There's a pension plan that guarantees security forever, and the company picnics are legendary throughout the valley. The children are telling me about the school, which teaches not just traditional subjects but also the history and customs of Ravens Hollow. I'll learn about the town's founding, the disaster that created their current situation, and the supernatural principles that keep their community stable. It's fascinating curriculum that no university in the outside world could offer. They're all being so kind, so welcoming. How could I have thought of them as threats? They're offering me something precious, a chance to belong completely, to be part of something larger than myself, to contribute to a community that values every member. My camera is still recording, though I'm not sure why I'm continuing to document this experience. Maybe it's habit, maybe it's hope that someone will learn from my story, or maybe it's just the last vestige of who I used to be trying to leave something behind. The sunset's beginning now, though my watch still shows mid-afternoon. Time works differently in Ravens Hollow when you're becoming part of it. The streetlights are fully illuminated, casting a warm, golden glow over Main Street that makes everything look like a Norman Rockwell painting. This is the town as it's meant to be seen, not empty and abandoned, but alive with purpose and community. I can see other newcomers among the crowd, people who found their way to Ravens Hollow over the decades and chose to stay. They look happy, fulfilled, at peace in ways that people in the outside world rarely achieve. There's Dr. Hartwell, the parapsychologist from the 1950s, now serving as the town's physician and helping other visitors understand their transition. There's a young man named Marcus who arrived in the 1980s and now runs the general store. A woman named Jennifer from the 1990s has become the town librarian. They all made the same choice I'm making now, and none of them seem to regret it. When I look at them, I see contentment, purpose, belonging. They found something in Ravens Hollow that they couldn't find in their original lives, and they traded their uncertain futures for guaranteed happiness. Is that such a terrible fate? The world I'm leaving behind is full of problems I could never solve, conflicts I could never resolve, loneliness I could never completely escape. Here in Ravens Hollow, those problems don't exist. Here, every day is meaningful, every person is valued, every moment is shared with people who genuinely care about each other. My transformation is nearly complete now. I can feel my memories of the outside world becoming distant, like half-remembered dreams. The urgency I felt about documenting this place, about warning future visitors, is fading into acceptance. Why would I want to warn people away from something so wonderful? Why would I deny others the chance to experience this perfect community? But some stubborn part of me, the part that chose to be a documentary filmmaker, that dedicated my life to uncovering hidden truths, insists that I finish this recording. So, here's what I want you to understand about Ravens Hollow. The town is real. The supernatural preservation is real. The rules are real, and they work exactly as advertised. If you follow the original 13 protocols from the visitor center, you can visit safely and return to tell others about this impossible place. But if you break those rules, you'll become part of Ravens Hollow forever. The choice isn't really between life and death, it's between uncertainty and certainty, between struggle and peace, between the chaos of the modern world and the perfect order of an eternal community. The residents of Raven's Hollow aren't monsters trying to trap innocent victims. They're evangelists sharing something they genuinely believe is better than what the outside world has to offer. Maybe they're right. Maybe this is evolution, the next step for humanity, a way to transcend the limitations of mortal existence and create communities based on mutual support rather than competition. Maybe the visitors who stayed didn't lose their lives but found better ones. I don't know anymore. The person I was, Austin Keller, the documentary filmmaker from Denver, would have fought this transformation, would have seen it as a tragedy, but the person I'm becoming, Austin Keller, the newest resident of Raven's Hollow, sees it as a homecoming. Mrs. Henderson is offering me a slice of fresh apple pie, still warm from the oven. Tom Kowalski wants to show me the factory's new safety protocols, designed to prevent any repetition of the 1943 disaster. The children are asking if I want to see their playground, which has the most elaborate swing set in Wyoming. How can I refuse such kindness? How can I resist such genuine warmth and welcome? I'm setting down my camera now. The recording will end soon when the last of my old self fades away. If someone finds this equipment, if they listen to this story, I hope they'll understand that what happened to me wasn't a tragedy, it was a transformation. Raven's Hollow is waiting for visitors who appreciate what it has to offer. The rules exist to protect both the living and the dead, to maintain the balance that allows this impossible place to exist. Follow them carefully and you can witness something miraculous. Break them and you can become part of something even more miraculous. The choice, as always, is yours. Welcome to Raven's Hollow, population 735, and growing.